Hey, welcome back to U.S. History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we have a fairly short lesson. We're going to be covering the textbook section From War to Peace. So continuing to talk about World War I. By the end of today, you should be able to identify the role that the U.S. played at the end of World War I, describe President Woodrow Wilson's vision for the post-war world, and explain why the United States never formally approved the Treaty of Versailles or joined the League of Nations. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the end of the war, some battles, and transitioning into peace. So the United States didn't join World War I until April of 1917. The war had been going on for some years. So American involvement was ultimately short in the grand scheme of things, but crucial and helpful. We brought a lot of resources when resources were depleted. U.S. reinforcements came at an important moment for the Allies. And so we talked about the key factors that led the United States to enter the war in a previous lesson, so I'm not going to review those. We're going to talk about how the United States helped. So the Allied forces were near exhaustion by 1917. Britain and France were heavily in debt, and the British delegation requested immediate reinforcements of U.S. troops. The goal was to boost morale and weaken the German fighting spirit. So President Wilson agreed, sending 200,000 troops in June of 1917. Why do you think the Allies specifically requested troops rather than just supplies or funding? I would argue that fresh, rested men who were not feeling defeated and like they had been at war their whole lives were going to raise the spirits of the vast majority of troops who had already been there. So the first American troops arrived in Europe in June 1917, and they were initially placed in quiet zones for training. So they were prepped for combat while away from the front lines. In March of 1918, the following year, Germany had won on the Eastern Front, and there was a Russian Revolution, which led to a peace treaty between Russia and Germany. So Germany continued to advance. They were encouraged by their victory on the Eastern Front, so they continued to advance on Allied lines. France and Britain asked Wilson to commit troops immediately, and he agreed. And by May of 1918, around a year after we joined the war, Americans were fully involved and fully engaged. So some key battles that took place. I'm not going to talk about all of them. Some that you may have heard of are listed here on the slide. And Americans fought alongside British and French armies and ultimately succeeded in pushing back that German offensive. These all happened kind of during the summer period of 1918. That was often when battles were fought during the good weather. And so this summer was a big, big pushback against the German offensive. Then we transitioned, or during the same time, Americans were also pushing their own offensive attacks. So in May 28, 1918, American troops overran German headquarters in less than 2 hours and proved their capability to French commanders. And so the physical joining of troops really helped turn the tide of the war. All right. I don't want to talk about that. We're going to kind of big picture overview here. If you want to read specific battles, you can look at the textbook or kind of dive deep into those on your own. But what I want to talk about is kind of the big picture overview. Okay, the battles that happened during the summer of 1918 marked a turning point. It kind of shifted from the French and the British struggling not to lose ground to the French, the British, and Americans pushing back and beginning to defeat Germany. And many people attribute that to the entry of fresh American troops affecting the dynamic positively, along with fresh American supplies. Most of this war was fought literally in the trenches. Soldiers faced constant danger, wounds, capture, and brought home a lot of physical and psychological scars. This war was fought with trench warfare, and so it was different than wars that had been fought in the past, right? Ground was fought inch by inch by inch rather than shooting someone from across a field. You know, you had gas and bombs and shooting and heavy artillery and machine guns and airplanes, and it was just fought very differently. So the final offensive was fought in late 1918. It lasted 40 days of intense fighting, and then finally the German lines were broken. German military reported to the Kaiser at the time, and a need for peace negotiations became evident. So in a year, the tide really turned for Germany. And kind of going from winning on the Eastern Front to losing the war overall happened. The majority of that happened during 1918. So the leader of Germany, the Kaiser William II, Wilhelm, I should say, abdicated on November 9th, 1918, and fled to the Netherlands. So the Germany and the Allies declared armistice on November 11th, 1918. This is why November 11th is still a national holiday today, to honor this date. Fighting stopped, which signaled the beginning of the peace process. The war had a huge human cost, right? This was a worldwide war, not necessarily meaning that every single country fought, but it wasn't just fought between two different countries, right? Many countries, and therefore people were heavily involved. Deaths on the Allied side included over 5.7 million, although this was mostly Russian, British, and French since the Americans took so long to join. The opposing side, the Central Powers, lost 4 million, over half of which were German soldiers. And when we move forward in time, we're going to talk a little bit about the resolution of World War I, specifically how Germany was treated after they lost. I'm going to kind of point out some of the things that ultimately set the stage for World War II to happen. And we'll talk about those in a later lesson. Financially, the war cost the United States over at minimum $32 billion. After interest and benefits were provided, it actually exceeded $100 billion. And of course, had an economic toll on all of the countries, especially European countries where the war was physically fought on their soil. And things had been bombed and ruined and physically destroyed, and farms had been burnt, and cities had been just crumbled. Rebuilding took a long time. So things that I want to leave you with to think about is that America's role ultimately in the war was short but decisive, and many historians agree that the involvement of the U.S. helped turn the tide. So things that you can kind of think about: did the decision to enter the war, right? Was it the right decision for the United States? Was it the right decision to wait as long as they had? Should they have joined sooner? How did the military impact the Allied victory? Was the U.S. involvement as important as we think? And what were the economic consequences, short-term and long-term, as a result of World War I? So those are sort of things that, if you were in a live class, we'd break into groups and discuss. But for this lesson, stew on them on your own and be kind of percolating on them.